That's great. So let's kind of look back at everything that's happened in the past year. And I think there's two things, really big topics. And one of them is COVID. It's probably the biggest, obviously, that's affected everyone globally. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting, especially for automotive sales, because when you look at it domestically and globally, there was a huge nosedive in new car sales. However, globally, what's interesting is what actually went out was electric vehicle sales. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think a big part was people are seeing when people are driving less, there is actually a pretty strong correlation to cleaner air, and then the other part of that is just if you're looking at like the average transaction price of cars in general, it's been going up. So it actually kind of does work for EVs. What are you seeing around the conversation of like kind of takeaways or shifts in conversation since COVID, and how that's kind of impacting some of the work that you're doing with ZETA?
Well, I think ultimately one of the most impactful changes is, I think, a socialization that we need to invest in strategic ways in order to solve our society's problems. And I think we're federally. I certainly, my hope is that we tend to match resources to problems, and we don't first have an austerity litmus test. I think some of the austerity politics of the past has led to some of the challenges that we face today, and that could be a ailing infrastructure in the country. It could be certainly a lapse and an inability to address climate change. So my hope is that we're entering a new era where we decide that taking on big challenges is worthy of the society that we live in. And if you look back at all of the kind of big upheavals and turmoil that we faced as a country, we've always emerged stronger because we were willing to take big, bold action to address them. And I think Bill Gates did a nice job over the weekend on some of the Sunday shows talking about how the resiliency and the impacts that we might confront and the needs for resiliency are going to be far more disruptive if we don't address climate change than what we're seeing with COVID right now. I think the way he described it is it'll blow COVID out of the water, some of the impacts and the humanity that we're going to be challenged by. And so, to me, that's my hope, is that people see what a disruption in life can look like, and it kind of brings to the fore that this is something that's possible. I think we've in some ways been seduced by this complacency that we don't need to try hard things and we don't need to act boldly because there's just this mean reversion of life that will coast and get us by. But when it's been taken away from you, like it has been for so many Americans, I think it's an opportunity for us to look and say, how do we do better? How do we actually invest in our communities and make smart decisions that that really make that sort of life and in pursuit of happiness a reality for folks.
That's great. One thing that just kind of popped up in my head is a conversation I've had around when you mention infrastructure, like how do you move this forward? Because a big thing that's figured into infrastructure traditionally is gas tax, both on federal and state, and they all kind of have different ways to approach it, especially when you get to the state level. But that is kind of becoming a conversation. I think in some ways it has been used almost as a way to kind of push back on EVs than an actual way to look about how to incentivize them and move them forward. Yep. But it is a valid conversation, especially around like utilities with some of these upgrades they have to make and trying to figure out a way to do these upgrades so there are EVs can be driven for everyone, but then it's usually a cost that's getting passed on to everyone, whether they have an EV or not, as part of a ratepayer for these utilities.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so the 2 points, I guess I'll start with the utility side. So it is, that's one of the kind of the EV antagonists' favorite argument is that everybody's electric bills are going to skyrocket. There was an example in the Carolinas where they pursued a pretty robust investment in EV charging. They got it approved by the state regulator. And I think the net impact on folks' electricity bills was 12 cents a month. So really what we're talking about here, it's kind of a scare tactic. It's cents, per month rather than dollars. And so I think, it's kind of a easy foil, for folks to go and try to, say that EVs are going to be the end of the world. The other on the infrastructure side, I think, we have the ability to finance a world-class infrastructure in this country. And, the gas tax has been broken for decades. And we actually, we've severed, years ago, we severed the gas tax and its adequacy to address our infrastructure needs. We take from the federal treasury, and have for decades, money to make sure that, that we're addressing failing infrastructure. And candidly, we've done a poor job at it. But still, it is, a minority of it is funded through the gas tax. Most of this comes from the federal treasury. And so, for 1% penetration for electric vehicles in a lot of regions, to point the finger at EVs and say, it's the reason the gas tax is broken, is pretty disingenuous. And so ultimately, I think where we need to move is a vehicle miles traveled in I think a tech neutral way. And ultimately what folks have done, certainly state houses across the country, let's say, for example, your average gas tax that a consumer would pay in a given year, let's say, is $100. What they'll do is they'll point the finger at EVs and then go charge $150 in an EV tax as a way to address what is the quote unquote inequity in it. But ultimately what that does is it's largely driven by the oil and gas interests and the refiners, because they see it as an existential threat to their business model, and it's just punitive. And so ultimately what we need to get to is a system where it's a user fee, and we have a real conversation about reform, and it's something that everybody contributes to fairly. And again, at the end of the day, it's something that most people don't think twice about, and we fairly and equitably resource the challenges that we face as a country. And I think that's something that everybody wants to strive for. And it's not terribly complicated, but you've got a lot of political interests that are going to scrum and fight for their carbon supremacy over our economy along the way.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.